federal government. He's waiting for guidance on the task force. As we talk about Florida, one of the coming hotspots in this pandemic, well, President Trump has a close relationship with Governor DeSantis. If Governor DeSantis really isn't perceptive enough to see where this is headed and what it could do to his state, we should implore the president to make that phone call to Governor DeSantis. If he's in fact waiting by the phone for Donald Trump to tell him what to do, please, Mr. President, call the governor and tell him what to do, because, my gosh, it's coming to Florida and it's coming fast. Dr. Emanuel, I did want to ask you about a question that was posed at the news conference yesterday, which is this. If we had put in place, if the federal government had put in place mitigation efforts earlier, if the federal government had taken this more seriously a month ago, 2 months ago, would we not be looking at this staggering curve that shows the potential for 100,000 to 240,000 deaths, as you point out, in a best case scenario? So I'll ask you that question. If we had taken this seriously as a federal government much earlier, what would that number look like compared to what it is today?
Well, I mean, again, the 100,000 to 250 is a best case scenario. I'm not a modeler, and I'm not privileged to the modeling at the moment. But it's certainly, again, remember, part of it is how high that curve is, how many people die. Part of it is how much it's spread out, so you don't have the mayhem you have in New York City hospitals at the moment. It's certainly the case 2 months ago, if we had done these social distancing measures and this physical distancing mitigation measures, we would have probably been able to keep that peak much lower and spread it out so we wouldn't have chaos, the fighting for ventilators, the lack of PPE, and all the other things that have come with it. At the exact peak, Willie, I can't tell you what it would have been, but it probably would have been 50 to 100,000 out there, and it would have been spread out. We wouldn't have had this surge, which I think, again, we have to remember that's just as important. And we wouldn't have a worst case scenario of being 2 million, which I think, again, people are not talking about. But that's a real admission by the president and the White House that if we don't actually act, we could have basically double the number of Americans who die in a year. And I think that if there's anything that should be sobering and really make people fearful, it's that number. That this is what happens if Florida is the norm and we don't adopt what has happened in Seattle or San Francisco as the norm. And I think that's that's the choice we have.
Yeah. Well, if Ron DeSantis, Mr. President, is too much of a coward to shut down the state of Florida on his own, you need to give him a call today and tell him to shut down the state of Florida. Are there going to be a lot of dead senior citizens that are going to have to be buried over the next several months because of this inaction? And that's science. That's data. That's not politics. It's Republicans as well as Democrats, independents that are going to die. People in the greatest generation, a lot of them who were born in World War II, who grew up like my parents are born during the Great Depression and grew up, were young during World War II and helped build the American century. Those are the people who are being betrayed and abandoned right now because the governor of the state of Florida won't shut down beaches and sandbars. And I tell you, last weekend, I saw pictures from last weekend. The sandbars were still packed. And by the way, Mr. President, a lot of Trump flags on the boats at the sandbars with people acting like total jackasses, infecting each other, taking those infections home, infecting their parents and infecting their grandparents and sending them to hospitals. Think about that.
That's not good branding. Think about that. I don't know what gets through to him.
That's happening every weekend in Florida. The recklessness is just unbelievable. So please call Ron DeSantis, since he doesn't have a backbone, apparently, since he still can't see everything that's been happening over the past couple of months and still won't do what is required to save senior citizens from this hellish end to their life. Dying alone.
Right.
Dying alone. Give him a call today, Mr. President, and tell him to do the right thing and shut down Florida. This impacts you, too. If you don't want to do it for the right reason, do it for the political reason. So, Jim VandeHei, we all know what a mess Florida is. And it's a state I certainly know an awful lot about. You know an awful lot about the state of Wisconsin. I haven't heard a whole lot coming out of Wisconsin as far as reckless behavior. A lot of Floridians still don't get it because of the president and because of Ron DeSantis. What about in Wisconsin? How for the most part, what are you hearing out of your home state?
It's not been hit as hard as others. They're certainly having a very similar directives from the governor there. Michigan's getting hit a lot harder right now than the state of Wisconsin is. But any state, whether it's DeSantis or anyone else, you got your directive last night. Name the last time that a president of the United States stood before the American people and warned with specificity the number of people that are going to die, and then followed it up with the precise steps that you have to take to be able to avoid it. He doesn't need a call. Who needs a call from the president? The president has basically endorsed what's going on in New York. This isn't, again, it's not science. It's not rocket science. You know now exactly what you have to be able to do. And history won't forget yesterday. It was an astonishing press conference where you had the president of the United States telling us grimly, darkly, in a somber tone we've never seen before from him, that death is coming, and it's coming fast, and that individuals, and this is rare, like, well, how many times can we individually do something to decrease the chances that someone else dies? Like, you actually have that opportunity, and now everybody has to do it. Or, as Dr. Emanuel said, 250 might have been wishful thinking. Like those decisions that are being made today. And you guys are right. You should keep picking at what happened the last 2 months. And for people who say, oh, stop harping on the past, the reason that you have to harp on the past is that this will happen again. There are steps that you could write down in a book. They were already written down in a book, by the way, of what you have to do if a pandemic's coming. How do you have to mobilize your industry? How do you have to be able to move into lockdown? How do you have to mobilize the federal government? This stuff is known, and now it's even more known, and hopefully people now put this into practice going forward.
And yeah, we do have to continue keeping the pressure on. You know, I've been calling, I'll just say it, I've been calling friends in the White House for a couple of weeks now, begging them to do 2 weeks ago what they did yesterday, begging them to be more serious. As you know, when I came on this show, I irritated a lot of people by encouraging the president, agreeing that we're all on the same team. When he held press conferences where he seemed to understand the gravity of this, we talked about that in a positive sense. But while there was gravity yesterday, what happens today? What happens tomorrow? Is he going to continue behaving that way like a president who is facing one of the grimmest months in the history of our republic? Let us hope so, because, Willie, here's what we know. According to the president, and according to Dr. Birx, and according to Dr. Fauci, this is what we know. We know more Americans are going to die in April than died on 9/11. We know more Americans are going to die in April than died in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, World War I, most likely, Vietnam, go back to the Korean War, our decade in Afghanistan. In fact, you can add up most of those wars other than World War I, and more people are going to die in the month of April from this pandemic that the president and his allies dismissed as the flu, that Rush Limbaugh dismissed as the flu, that everybody that sucked up to Donald Trump dismissed as an exaggerated hoax. This is what we are facing in this coming month. And it's the most sobering part of it. So look at this. More people are going to die this month than died on September 11th, the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War, and the Vietnam War, just from this. And Mika, this is the best case scenario.
Right.
If we do everything right, if Florida shuts down and if everybody shuts down, 100 to 240,000. It's the best case scenario. Well, it could be worse.
The president says he closed the borders. He knew about it. That every time he talks about closing the borders, he lets us know he chose not to ramp up on testing. He chose not to put together a team, perhaps refill the pandemic office that he emptied out. He chose not to stock up on masks and supplies. He's telling us that he knew about this and did nothing. Every time he talks about the one thing he did.
But hold on, Willie, he didn't even close the borders the correct way with China. I know there are a lot